Greetings, legendary listeners. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of the latest episode of Marvel television. And that means it's time to talk about the epic season, not series, finale of Loki titled For All Time, Always. There are a lot of podcasts that talk about Marvel TV, but what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack is the way we organize our approach. We divide our analysis of each Marvel TV episode into 3 distinct shows, each with its own unique lens. This helps us focus our discussions and helps you retain information. Pondervision will be coming at you on Saturday to interrogate the most captivating conundrums posed by the finale, including where Loki ended up, a bunch of great possibilities for the new multiverse, and so much more. On Monday, our character cast with Christine Kippens will break down the fates, fortunes, and futures of everyone, from He Who Remains to Loki, Sylvie, Loki and Sylvie's relationship, and of course, the most nefarious teacher in the history of Ohio, Ravonna Renslayer. But as always, we begin our analysis with this show, our Storycast. This is where we break down the latest episode of Marvel TV, not by plot, but by themes, tropes, genres, and archetypes. This is one of the most unique and original TV analysis shows anywhere, and you can only get it here on the Marvelous TV Club. And it's our last week for Loki merch, so if you're into this show, if you like our logo with the little Loki outline, now's your chance to get the shirt, get the mug, whatever works for you, because after this week, I'll probably take it down. So marveloustvclub.com if you want any of that, and if you want something you don't see for the next round of shows, leave it in a 5-star review. I'm your multiversal, multi-hyphenate, host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more. God knows what other versions of me are doing for their jobs. I'm Marc Faletti, and as always on Storycast, I'm joined by our 2 story experts in this reality.
I'm Amanda Marcotte. I'm a politics writer for Salon.com, and this variant is definitely my most evil variant.
And I'm Maeve Adams, professor of English at Manhattan College and director of the Digital Arts and Humanities program. And frankly, I can't imagine a better variant than me.
I absolutely agree. On both counts, actually. Amanda is just a monster constantly. No, if this is the most evil version, I'll be curious to see what the other ones are up to.
I mean, now it's infinite universes, so truly, who knows?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
How do you measure that?
It's Amanda's all the way down. But this was the first Marvel project to end in a proper cliffhanger since 2018's Infinity War. By the way, that is the same year that we saw Ravonna in Ohio. Interesting note. Mm-hmm. So, were you expecting more closure based on the past shows that we'd gotten, or were you delighted by the open-ended possibilities, Amanda?
I mean, both. I expected the show to end like the other ones and was thrilled that it didn't. I really look forward to season 2 of Loki. I think Loki has been my favorite of the Marvel TV shows so far.
What about you, Maeve? Did it strike you as surprising that they gave us a little less closure than we're used to?
Not really, because this whole stable of shows, even though the other series have been less open-ended, they're all linked to one another. We're always expecting something else that might be connected or might not be connected. And I'll just agree with Amanda on this, that for me, part of the reason why this show is I'm so excited about another season is that even though WandaVision was as formally experimental from the perspective of genre, this was aesthetically experimental in all kinds of ways, both, in terms of the color palette, the sort of reckoning with bureaucracy as an aesthetic, and the music. I mean, we haven't talked a lot about music. I hope we'll get to talk about that today. The music is beautiful and bizarre, and I feel like the showrunners and the studio really leaned into something unique and bizarre and strange and fun, and I'm excited to see what comes next.
Yeah, same. I feel like people forgot what a cliffhanger was like based on how the internet was responding, but we will get to some of that later, I suspect. What we're going to do today is what we usually do, explore 2 primary themes of this finale, which was jam-packed with big ideas and difficult questions. Just want to add a note at the top, though. Technically, Jonathan Majors' character was named He Who Remains, which is a Marvel Comics character. But we also know he's going to play Kang in Ant-Man. Was this guy also Kang? Was Kang just the statue version at the end? Because that statue was wearing the traditional Kang outfit minus the mask and helmet. Anyway, Kang goes by a bunch of names in the comics. He's Immortus. He's this good guy named Iron Lad. He's Nathaniel Richards. He's all kinds of things. We're going to call him Kang in this episode, but don't be surprised if Kang is just one very specific iteration of this character, but not the umbrella name for all of them, like Loki is the umbrella name for all of those characters. But that's a story for an undetermined future time on the timeline. But let's talk about what we do know about this finale. Amanda, where do we begin? What did you see as the primary theme of this most unusual finale?
Well, I felt like they were pulling towards this theme for most of the season, and so I was kind of thrilled that they landed here. But the theme I kind of landed on was a quote from Voltaire, which was, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him." I think that the episode invokes this idea and then just shits all over it. In fact, I would say like this episode, the series has been deeply, deeply atheistic. It is a show about destroying God, destroying the conception of God, and more importantly, I think destroying the church authority that flows from the concept of God. It's about destroying the concept of faith and the very idea that we should take anything on faith, that we should invest so much of ourself and so much of our being in like this idea of a God that doesn't even prove, that's hidden from us, that there's no even real evidence for. You know, whether audience members are believers or not, I think that's fine. That's not what I'm saying here. Is you believe what you want to believe. But this particular episode, this particular series, I think had a very strong atheistic argument for it. As you know, you usually get when you have a story about somebody trying to find God, and when they meet them, they kill them.
It feels like there's a lot to choose from, but if you had to pick one key scene or thread that crystallized this theme, what drove it home for you?
So the fight between Loki and Sylvie was really important to this, because I think that when we go back to that Voltaire quote, if there was no God, we would have to invent him. They're basically debating that quote when they have their fight. And so, I mean, there's been a lot of historical debate over whether or not Voltaire himself was an atheist. I think the snark behind that particular quote gives you a good indication of what I think is probably true. But whether he was or not, I think that what's troubling about the idea behind that quote is this idea that human beings need God to control them, to keep them in order, to keep civilization together. And so even if there isn't a God, there should be a lie created. A God should be invented in order to get people in order. And that's basically what Kang argues to both Loki and Sylvie. And they sit there and they sit there with that argument for a minute, and Sylvie's like, nah, fuck that. Pulls out her sword, ready to kill him. And Loki, he's caught up in it, and he says, you know, we should hear it out, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we in the audience have grown so sympathetic to this Loki that we really feel his pain when she looks at him and is just like, I knew you were going to betray me.
Yeah.
But it is worth remembering that just a few days ago in his own timeline, he was trying to take over Earth, making a variation of the same argument that human beings should be forced to submit. And he was thinking of it in terms of brute force, but he got persuaded by Kang's kind of view that you can cause submission by creating this false God that everybody has to have faith in.
Yeah, that ideology is as dangerous, or as forceful, rather. It's as forceful as, you know, an actual cudgel.
Yeah, and you know, maybe he's right. Maybe Loki doesn't want a throne, like he says, but he is still caught up, and Sylvie still sees through him, caught up in this idea that people need to be brought into a certain kind of order, and that this is a way to do it.
Yeah. You know, it's funny too, because that Voltaire quote comes from a poem where Voltaire is presenting himself as a poet who has helped to expand conceptions of justice and other kinds of democratic ideals, but then insists that basically there's a whole segment of the population that if it weren't for the idea of an afterlife, that basically people would just be doing crime all the time, right? That we need this order, we need this conception of more than just like a God that watches you or surveils you, but that will punish you. This is a punishing God. It is a cruel God. It is not a God that loves universally and to the end of time. It's a God that will also destroy you, prune you if you step off the path.
And then feed you to a smoke beast that presumably, that doesn't feel great.
No, I'm sure it feels terrible.
And it's an idea that persists for centuries and generations. I would say a lot of people nowadays believe that the only thing that keeps human beings from turning into feral animals is the threat of punishment.
Yeah.
Or the idea of a God watching you, surveillance, that sort of thing. I mean, it's instilled in us from childhood with Santa Claus, right?
Sort of. Yes, you're right. You're right. The good and bad. I know. There's a little piece of me that's like, but Santa. Yeah, fair enough. I'm beholden to Santa as God.
Wow.
Well, but the like naughty and nice list, right?
No, you're totally right. There was just like an instinct in me that was like, no, not Santa. But you've got a really good point, because it's also that this is a God that metes out punishment, that distinguishes in this way that is hard to make sense of, right? It's not a transparent form of justice. Good and bad, you sort of have to learn it through the process of, looking up to people who are above you, who tell you this is good and bad. But it's a God that also mocks when you fail, when you trip up, right? Kang is laughing through this whole fight scene between the two of them as if these are mere mortals playing with good and evil and whatever, right? Like I'm gonna mete out justice the way I choose.
What's cool about this particular episode is that Loki is a pagan god, and he is very much beholden to a lot of kind of pagan mentality about things, in which he's not omniscient, he's not omnipotent, he has a power set, but like other gods. But Kang is presented very much like the Christian God, right?
Yes.
He says, I think he literally says, I know it all. I've seen it all. He's omnipotent. He's omniscient.
Yeah.
It also brings up another problem that Christian theology has always struggled with, which is the problem of evil. If God is omniscient and God is omnipotent, then God created evil.
Correct.
But God is supposedly all good as well. And this is a problem, a paradox that Christian theologians have struggled with and have never come up with a good answer for.
Yeah.
And Kang, his answer is he's both. He presents himself both as God and as Satan.
Yeah.
He's in a church environment. He's covered with the robes. He looks like a priest.
Yeah.
He talks about the dogma. And yet he also, when he first meets Loki and Sylvie, is carrying the apple as if he was a serpent trying to tempt Adam and Eve. And then he literally tries to tempt them. He tries to draw them to the dark side, and he causes this fight between them. So he is both. He is evil, and he's all evil, and he's all good. So
he has a justification for it that is not exactly, I don't think, although I'm not an expert on Christian theology, really. He has an explanation for it, which is that we have to do bad in order to do good, which is how he tries to rope them into his project, right? He says, you're going to have to go and do bad for the good, which is a little bit ends justify the means argument, which we've seen in other moments in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, moments that end up being represented as faulty or rooted in faulty logic in other cases. So we as watchers of the Marvel Cinematic Universe know that we're supposed to be a little skeptical of this argument, not just because it's frankly a stupid argument, but also because it doesn't pan out in other instances.
And Christian theology has their own version of this argument, which is the book of Job and this idea that God allows Satan to exist and be evil precisely to tempt and test his people.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And when you think about that, God is kind of also Satan because he's toying with you. And at one point, Sylvie accuses him of toying with them.
And this is a game. And their lives aren't a game, but they become pawns in Kang's game to control the universe and enjoy it all the while. Because, to go back to my point earlier, Kang is constantly laughing and having a good time. He seems like, he's in his own living room, just sort of watching people be pruned and his orderly universe maintained, which maybe is also why Sylvie is so right on about the fact that he's lying, that, this serves him, right? This isn't simply a conception of the good that Kang has elaborated as some kind of theology. It's self-serving.
Throughout this show, Sylvie has been, I think, the hero of the story, even if she's not the protagonist.
Agree.
And her reaction is very steadfast. If you meet God, you kill him.
Yeah.
And, Sylvie is a true atheist. It's not even just that, she doesn't believe in God. And, he is just a man, a flesh and blood man.
Yeah, as he says.
But she thinks that a God is an inherently illegitimate idea because he takes away your freedom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you first raised this idea of it being a story of atheism, my first instinct was to be like, well, I don't know if Kang's really God. But then I thought about it for just a second, and I was like, what else would God be doing other than controlling the fates of everyone around him? He's controlling whether or not any of us step out of line according to a preordained script that he has designed, and he has the power to do that. You referred to him as omnipotent, and he absolutely is. I'm not even sure what other powers a god could have besides the ability to determine the fate of every single being and keep them in line with his predetermined vision for reasons that are unknowable to everybody else but him. So I think it's tough to argue.
And Renslayer literally calls him the only person in the universe with free will.
Yeah.
That makes him a god. That makes him not a god. That makes him a monotheistic the god.
It also makes him a dictator.
Which he calls himself.
Right. And this is the argument the dictators make. And of course, lots of dictators are fine with being called dictators because what they believe fundamentally is that number one, nobody else deserves free will because everybody else is too much of the hoi polloi to be able to handle free will. And number two, the argument they make is that everything else would be worse without me, right? Which is exactly the argument that Kang makes, that it's just going to be chaos. And what Sylvie understands, and what this show and every other show we've watched in this universe has been suggesting to us, is that there is a possibility of a pluralist society where there are competing interests. And what I'm doing here is I'm projecting outward from one society to the multiverse, but that we can find a way. And political philosophers have been working on this for centuries in theorizing democracy. How do we understand what a collective can be, what it can achieve when we recognize that there are competing interests and those interests need to be squared one way or another with each other without squashing one in favor of another, or even worse, elevating an individual above the collective.
This is where you can kind of set aside the bigger and impossible to answer question of whether there is a God and actually kind of look at the social, political implications of a church that argues that there is only one God and that his view, Voltaire's idea that if there wasn't a God, we'd have to invent him because whenever a church is speaking for God and saying that this is what he believes, in a sense, and this is kind of what Voltaire was saying, he was just saying it was justifiable. They are saying that some people know better than other people and that they are justified in making shit up and lying to other people to manipulate them and bring them under their control. And so the question is a dictator versus a church,
Right.
like an authoritarian church. One just sort of offloads the authority onto this invisible being that they've functionally made up in terms of who gets to tell you what to do. A dictator just says, it's me. So Loki was kind of that in the Avengers movie. But either way, they're the person who says, you don't deserve freedom because you can't handle it.
It's the you can't handle the truth of freedom.
Right. Which is Loki's argument from 2012.
And it's also not old, right? Like this isn't just like, a Voltairean universe, late 18th century, a lot of very believing people, right? This is immediately relevant in the modern world. The Pope in 2019 delivered an encyclical that its first line was, faith leads a believer to see in the other a brother or sister to be supported and loved. Okay, so it's an argument about peace and not war, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever people say about the Pope and his support of all kinds of good things, he's still the Pope of the Catholic Church that wants to retain its supremacy in one part of the Judeo-Christian world. The argument that he begins with is bullshit. We do not need faith to recognize the humanity of other people. We are hardwired to see other humans as worthy of preserving. It's evolutionary. It's biological. We don't require religion to know that the person across the road or the person next to us on the subway shouldn't be murdered. We don't need religion.
It's not just biological, it's rational.
Yeah.
Like, you can also make the secular, completely atheistic argument that other people are obviously real and they're obviously people and they obviously have the same rights as you do. And the problem is, what's interesting about the kind of religious authority and the notion of faith is the whole point of faith is to take something on faith, which is to say, without evidence, without rationality. And Sylvie is a faithless person. And this show, she has some downsides to where she has trust issues, but a faithless person is also shown as the person who is most morally centered in this universe because she doesn't offload her moral responsibilities onto some literally hidden and fake god in Kang.
Yeah, and some abstract being that...
Yeah, she believes what she believes because of empirical evidence brought in by her senses.
Right. And I think we have to distinguish. There's an important distinction to make between faithlessness and an inability to trust. Because in both cases, Sylvie has empirical evidence that trust is a tricky negotiation. And faith is dangerous, period. Sylvie knows rationally that faith is a bad thing, and that leads down the path to violence and maybe even self-annihilation. Trust is something that she tries, and she succeeds at in a couple of places. She's not without the capacity to trust. Faith and trust are not the same thing. And that is a subtle distinction that this show is helping create for us. We need that in the modern world. We need that right now. We need to understand that you can have trust. You can trust other people. You can trust the people you love. You might need to be careful, but faith is dangerous.
Yeah. So Kang has the power of a god, perhaps as much power as humans have ever conceived of any god having. He has the knowledge of a god and everybody's life and controlling it all. He does it in a deterministic Calvinist way of putting everybody in one path for his own purpose. All of the visual cues that you guys talked about point to him being godlike. You mentioned the robes and the eating of the apple. He is obviously in a giant church with these stained glass windows. There's a statue of three beings that's all very Trinity-esque.
And they look like monks. They're all wearing cloaks.
His amen. Like he really dragged that shit out. You guys have brought all that up. So all of the God imagery is pretty compelling. But you only mentioned one thing, Amanda, from that Renslayer and Mobius conversation around Renslayer's point about free will. Did you spot anything else from that scene that ties into this?
I think it was an echo of the fight between Sylvie and Loki, where Mobius now is playing the role of the skeptic, the atheist, and Renslayer is actually the faithless church authority.
Yeah.
She's basically in the Voltaire role, which is like, I don't care that there's not a God. We have to invent one because the alternative in her mind is impossible. It's chaos.
Yeah.
And this is Voltaire's argument, right? The idea that God has to exist to keep people under their control. But again, Renslayer is assuming that all this goodness is kind of flowing from the lie of the TVA, the lie of the timekeepers. And we don't actually see that necessarily. Just as the kind of arguments that the church, that God was necessary because without it people would be evil, you point to the church and you go, how much evil has been done in the name of God?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Across
how many
the planet.
people have been killed? How many, I don't want to go into dark places, but I want to, a lot of people who have faced this argument have rightfully pointed out that religion is definitely no prevention for doing evil things. And the TVA is a really good example. They say that they're good. They say they're doing things for good, but all we've ever seen them do is wipe out innocent people and send them to some apocalyptic hell where they get eaten by a smoke monster. And at a certain point you go, how good are you? Sylvie asked Mobius this in the last episode, you act like villains.
Yeah.
This all has a lot to do with God. But Amanda, you were talking about it being an atheistic approach to God. And yet the internet, or a considerable number of people on the internet, would like to tell me that Sylvie was wrong. Already on Reddit, there are memes floating around about how Sylvie is the dumbass. Multiple people are comparing her attack on Kang as equivalent to Quill waking Thanos up right before they get the glove off in Infinity War. Everybody is pointing out that Sylvie was wrong. Sylvie was wrong. She sucks. So how can this be an atheist argument if Sylvie was so damn wrong, Amanda?
Well, we don't know for a fact how this story ends, so we don't know that Sylvie was wrong.
Oh my goodness. You mean there's more to come?
Yay!
I mean, this is... I would tell people that if you ever really... I think there tends to be a lot of skepticism in our modern discourse of the idea that modern Americans would get bought into fascist arguments. But there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sylvie was wrong. No, King was wrong, I think. I think that's pretty clearly shown throughout this episode. His notion that... the problem wasn't Sylvie deciding to wipe this bad guy out. The problem was that he is a bad guy whose endless need for control caused the war in the first place. It caused a so-called solution to the war. Kang is the problem. And then he's presenting himself as the solution, and she just rejects that just outright. How can you be both the problem and the solution? And she may have not solve the problem in one fell blow, but she is pulling in the right direction. And I think more importantly, the question is, I think it goes back to Renslayer's argument that we need the TVA for order.
Right.
She's holding up right now, which is terrible, against all this hypothetical chaos and ignoring all the bad of now and only focusing on the potential chaos. And that's kind of a circular argument. And Sylvie's the kind of person who says, no. Stop trying to game out all these different scenarios and just do the right thing. Because you can't ever actually know what the outcome's going to be.
You know what's funny, Amanda, about your reference to Voltaire in this context is that for Voltaire, the police come first in warding off crime. And then God steps in. And so for Renslayer, of course, right? She's a Voltaire apologist also. Of course, the police need to be there to keep order so that God can only handle the ones at the end of time that need to be eaten by the dog or dragon or whatever the hell that is. But I think in this context, it's important to sort of think about, the way that we imagine justice. And Sylvie gets it because she was going to be the victim of this system of justice that disregarded any conception of her flourishing or her free will or just her capacity to survive. Really basic stuff.
It goes back to the podcast a couple episodes ago where we talked about how religious arguments have been used to marginalize queer people and, all sorts of, and women. And I think that Sylvie gets that intrinsically, which is, again, if you just say that this abstract authority gets to decide what's right and wrong for faith-based reasons, it becomes very easy, for instance, to say Sylvie doesn't get to exist because she doesn't fit.
She's aberrant.
Yeah.
And Amanda, when illegitimate oppressors are taken down in the real world, that's usually done in an incredibly orderly way, right? With zero problems, no bloodshed, and stability for all. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm trying to think of any time a church's authority's been challenged that it wasn't ugly.
Or even like dictatorial authority. It's an ugly thing that happens.
Yeah, this is going to be an ugly war. And we, as the audience, get to enjoy many movies, probably watching it play out.
Yay.
But yeah, there's no making omelets without breaking eggs. That's just all there is to it.
But I thought that was Kang's point. No, I'm just kidding. Look, I mean, my take to the folks who are out there calling Sylvia a dumbass and saying this was wrong is you might want to wait till the end of phase 4 to make this argument or reflect on how those posts are going to look by the time we're done with this. Because yes, just like what happens in the real world, when you remove a power source, a big source of power, there's a vacuum and a bunch of things are going to fill it and it's going to get chaotic and messy and bad. And they're all going to be Kangs, apparently. So great, we're going to get a giant vacuum full of Kangs. But to say that the only way to deal with the uncertainty or the problem posed before us is to just submit to unilateral dictatorship only because that dictator tells us to is incredibly terrifying. And you should examine your personal, you should examine your personal philosophy if that's where you wind up. You might be relying on evidence of things like, I know Kang is going to be in the Ant-Man movie, and therefore we must not disrupt the sacred timeline because there will be a bunch of Kangs. But please consider that Kang is likely to be defeated, and it will mean that just because Kang's approach was one way to relatively minimize the amount of violence, the ends cannot justify the means. We talked about that in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. We talked about that in Loki. We talked about all of that. And there has to be a better way. And even if it's difficult to find, that's the whole point of phase 4, gang. So just hang in there, will you? All right. Look, enough about the internet and various people out there being mad in Reddit threads at Sylvie. It's time to talk about works of literature and film, Amanda, that also touch on this theme. Where do we begin? What is the primary source of inspiration for this theme of attacking Voltaire's assumptions that we should invent God and that we need God?
I was so sure that this show was atheist that I put this on my list for many episodes prior and then took it off. But here we are. His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman.
Such a good book.
Mm-hmm.
Such a good series.
Such a good series. Please don't judge it by the movies or the TV show, please. The books are great. And the whole premise of the books is they're kind of inversion of the Chronicles of Narnia, right? Like the Chronicles of Narnia is kind of a classic fantasy story that it upholds faith and teaches children that faith is good. And His Dark Materials, starting with The Golden Compass, are a series of books that teach children faith is bad. And if you're like Sylvie and you meet God, you should kill him.
Get rid of that, dude. Get rid of Sky Daddy.
It has a lot. I think it's a very direct influence. You can see, for instance, His Dark Materials, the authority is obviously owes a lot to the Catholic Church, just like the TVA does in Loki. There's a lot of faithless priests in His Dark Materials, including the main character's mother. She's she's basically a faithless priest.
Yeah.
She doesn't believe in God necessarily, but she does believe in power and sees the church as a way to get to it. In his Dark Materials, kind of people's true selves, like the idea that human beings are sort of naturally good as long as they're true to themselves, and that they have to be disassociated from what's real and good about themselves in order to fall in line with authority, is very overtly symbolized in their demons that people have with them. And then I think in those books, you also see the idea that human sexuality and erotic love particularly is a threat to this kind of religious, faithful authority. And that's why religions so regularly try to stomp out sexual expression and police it, because they recognize that the connections that romantic love can create between people make them more capable of seeing through the lies of religious authorities. And I think we get all those themes here, right down to Loki and Sylvie realizing that their love for each other exposes the lie of the TVA and what they stand for.
Which is what Mobius talked about, which is why their connection could, and I quote, bring the whole thing down.
Yeah. And that's very true in his Dark Materials. They're in the last book, and they're children, so it's not explicit, but it's kind of symbolic that they have this romantic connection, and it gives them strength in each other that allows them to take down God or the authority.
I'm a huge fan of his Dark Materials. I love the comparison, and it really frames some of the things that we're talking about here, even though it has a happy ending and we're not there yet for this choice for these characters. But Maeve, we haven't said the M word, and I'm not talking about Mephisto. I'm talking about Marxism.
Yes!
Is there anything we've touched on that throughout this series? Does Marxism or anything around Marxism have anything to say about this theme?
Guys, yes.
Awesome.
Marx does, always. I am fully confident that basically the people in the writer's room are simpatico with me. I also love Dark Materials. I also love Marx, friends. So Marx, who we've brought up before, has a conception of religion as the opiate of the people, right? We've all heard this expression before. But this idea of religion as an opiate that sort of dumbs you down, it dulls your critical faculties, comes in a passage where Marx is invoking another writer, Feuerbach, where Marx is talking about what he calls the sigh of the oppressed creature. And what Marx and Feuerbach both mean by this idea is that human beings have capacity to do extraordinary things with one another, including, for both Marx and Feuerbach, achieving freedom from want, that all human beings could just survive really happily. And especially in industrialized economies, we can survive really happily. We can have all the food we need of various kinds from across the globe. We can coordinate this. We have the capacity to do that. But in the face of the way modernity presses against that through competition, for example, the way that capitalism creates hierarchies, what it means is that there's a whole bunch of people who are left without resources, and their only implement to respond to this is to sigh in the face of their oppression. And that sigh is religion, because they can't do anything about their oppression. And so they look to some externalized force that dictates that their oppression is rational, real, fate, for a word that this show constantly reinvokes. And Marx is, in my mind, a more interesting, if we're going to call anybody a God killer, Marx is a more interesting God killer than Nietzsche, because Nietzsche's formulation of this is important, super important, because he rejects, as we've talked about on this show, a simple dichotomy of good and evil, like Kang presents to the world, as if these things are simple. They're not simple. They're constructions. They are as much a fiction of authority as he is. But Marx offers us something that is even more subtle about it, that in our alienation from not just a sense of good and evil or a capacity to feel like we're making a contribution to the world in some abstract sense, our alienation from all of our creative capacities, our ability to just join together and come up with good ideas. Because somebody is in power who is saying, no, that's not really what we want to do right now, Kang, right? Or any other kind of industrialized power, any system of hierarchical authority. Marc says, what happens is we invent the idea of God to externalize the logic of oppression. It makes sense then. And so someone like Renslayer saying, I'm going and searching for free will, by which she means the singular free will of Kang or whatever.
Oh, that actually makes sense. I hadn't thought about the line that way. So she's going in search of the one in charge who she says is the only one who has free will. So when she's going in search of free will, I get
it's the sigh of the oppressed. This is Marx's sigh of the oppressed. And it almost comes out like a sigh of the oppressed, right? She chooses not to kill her friend who she's seen his, ring on the table. It's sweet and important, but because she cannot access herself, she is alienated in the extreme in the way that, according to the show, and frankly, according to my own sense of things, anybody who fully buys in to the logic of religion, it's the form of alienation that they experience, that we externalize and justify and let go of what makes human beings so fucking extraordinary, that we can build something together that is better than that.
On that front, Kang is a character with a lot of dualities. He's both God and Satan. He's both man and God.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the most interesting ones is that he says, I'm a man, flesh and blood, basically. And yet he is extraordinary. He has made himself a god because he's so smart and he's so creative, and he is in every iteration of himself. And so you can't help but both hate him for being an authoritarian monster and admire him for being so intelligent and so brilliant and for actually just being a man. This didn't actually come from God. This came from a flesh and blood man.
Yeah.
And so he is a testament to what you're saying about humans' capacity. We make up God, but we actually are God.
Yeah.
We're the God of God because we made him up.
We made him up. There's a wonderful moment right after he says flesh and blood. He picks his nose.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's perfection. It is like, I don't even know what to do with this series, because I'm like, so not only have the writers fully digested the ideas of Marx and have managed to pull off a fantasy conception of it that really does persuade at the most fundamental level. And then the directors are like, yeah, pick your nose right after that. Really get in there. Like, just, get in there. I mean, both get into the idea and get in your nose.
I'm guessing that was a Jonathan Majors choice, just because I have a tough time believing you'd be like, what I need here is a good old nose pick.
Nose pick.
I mean, if you watch Sex Education,
yes,
the director loves body humor.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Amanda, are there any other last thoughts of works or writers or films or anything we should keep in mind?
Well, Karl Marx is great. I think a lot of modern atheism has gotten a bad name because it's become the province of these like reactionary white dudes like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. And I just want you to go ahead and drop kick those mofos to the curb. There is a dead white guy, but he died not that long ago, that you should look into, though, which is Carl Sagan's writings. I think that's a much more compassionate, modern, very readable take on this kind of atheist thought. He wasn't an atheist because he thought that was too deterministic of a term, but I think that in a sense, it's more important to think that way. He was somebody who was saying just this, like, man is what is remarkable. Like our capacity in science and our capacity to understand and reach and our creativity and our ability to keep building on what we know, I think really underscores a lot of both what is great about Kang and what is evil about Kang. And so I think it would be, some of his writings would be a good counterpoint to the series to kind of, if you want to think about these themes further.
My last thought on this one is simply that Kang has the power of God. And I don't just mean a God, I mean the God, which we talked about. But if you think about that, then by extension, the Marvel Universe essentially precludes the possibility of there being a God inside of this universe. Because what would that even mean to have more power than the ability of Kang to control the individual destiny of every single being according to his own ends, to have the power and knowledge to see and do all of that? It's astonishingly radical that Marvel has essentially given all of that power to a 31st century mortal being. And I have a tough time believing that if there is a God as a Christian style God in the Marvel Universe, asleep on the job does not even begin to describe it.
But it actually gets to what Maeve was saying about pluralistic societies, right? Like in a dark way, kind of the corporate entertainment structure of Marvel, Disney in general, they have to sell their product to everyone in the world. And everyone in the world has different religions and different views on this. And so perversely, the best way to respect everybody's views is to have no respect for anybody's views.
Annihilate them all.
Annihilate them all.
I mean, they're not explicitly atheistic. So,
Right.
I mean, you can see it in there if you're paying attention, but I think a lot of people won't be, especially the kind of censors that would go after it. I think that you see this in a lot of these big Hollywood products that are meant for audiences of all different faiths. They just exist in this completely secular world because that's the only place we can all come together.
Right. I mean, and one other sort of more hopeful twist on that is the fact that the Marvel Universe has again and again questioned the idea of superpower. Not, I mean, the fact of having a power, but the idea of a superhero, somebody who has more power than anyone else. So I think there is a possibility of placing this in the context of a critique of that hierarchy of power, that even if you have more physical power than others, even if you have more intellectual power than others, more charismatic authority than others, maybe you shouldn't rule over everyone else. And this is, and again, a utopian view, but I think that there's a possibility that given what we've seen so far in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that there's a bit of a critique that is timely in our world of that kind of authoritarian system that prioritizes one kind or one thing above everything else.
Well, on that note, Maeve, let's move on to our second theme. What did you see when you watched that episode as the main theme or idea driving it?
I have to be honest, this episode threw me for a bit of a loop because almost every year I teach a course for freshmen that I love. It's a writing intensive course, and the subject of the course is love and war. This is a topic that I write about, that I think about a lot. And something that this episode did, I think this whole show is trying to do, is force us to decouple the history of war from the history of love.
Okay.
We can look back through an entire human canon of literature and film that has argued since the beginning of the time that humans were telling stories to one another that the story of war is a story of love, right? So, here we're going to have a war. It's about love of nation, Braveheart. It's about love of a woman. It's the Iliad. It's about the love of power. It's Apocalypse Now. It's the love of freedom. It's America's founding mythology. Loki rejects the idea that love and war are compatible or even complementary pursuits. The idea that those two things belong in the same story, this show suggests, is to totally misunderstand love in its entirety.
So tell me where you see that inside the episode itself.
So many of us wanted that moment, right? We've been talking about this in this show, right? And people across the internet have been talking about wanting to see the kind of fulfillment of this erotic or romantic or whatever kind of amorous tension between Loki and Sylvie. And we got it this episode. We got the fulfillment, right? So we get the standard filmic language of romance or even romantic comedy, right? So we get a framed shot with a couple at the center who realize their love for each other by kissing one another. And the music comes along with it, right? We get this like triumphant swelling orchestral chords. They reach a crescendo at their kiss and then start to resolve as it happens. And it is a love story, right? Like there's something really beautiful and modern about Loki's expression of love for Sylvie. They both cry, so it's a sympathetic reflection of one another. They feel each other's feelings. This is non-hierarchical. And then Loki says to her something that I think in love we all want to hear and all want to say to the person that we love, which is, I just want you to be okay. Whatever that means, whatever that involves. If it's a sacrifice or an extension of self, whatever it is. So we get this love story. But the problem is that that is not compatible with the universe that is at war or is going to be at war. Or maybe it's a misunderstanding of where love fits in a universe of people who have been at war or are about to go to war.
So they break up. I mean, I'm going to argue with you a bit. I think maybe that's true, but I think that it's also that Loki can't join Sylvie's war. Like, I think if they...
Yeah.
And there's previous iterations of Loki where the struggle of Loki's story in the Thor movies is that he's always competing. He's always at war with Thor, right?
Yeah.
And his journey is to join with Thor and be one with him in brotherly love.
Right.
But when they finally come together as they're supposed to, they're still fighting. They're just on the same side.
Yeah. No,
And
I think that's right.
And for me, it was both incredibly touching that Loki says to Sylvie, I want you to be okay, but it was also very paternalistic. And I think that there was a critique of the notion of chivalric romance in there, which was he got so caught up in the idea of protecting her, he didn't understand that truly loving her meant supporting her in her fight.
Yeah. No, and I think, for Sylvie, there is a conception of what is morally right, what is ethically right, that we are meant to adopt as viewers of this show, because it seems like Loki is wrong so many steps of the way. Sylvie gets it wrong too, but Loki is more wrong than Sylvie is on the front of how to proceed going forward. But from the perspective of the way that we tell the story of love and war, the idea of a kind of paternalism is written into that narrative. We're protecting our women and children, or we are seeking the love of a woman who's going to marry us and then recognize us as a hero in all of this. That's not what's happening in this show. And I think, and it's also not what's going to happen theoretically in the next season, because this couldn't get resolved as simply as every other story of love and war has been resolved. That once the war comes to an end, the love that was integral to the narrative of war just continues on. And everything is fine. And yes, we can go to war again, and that's also fine. Nothing is fine about the world that we're talking about here. Not only have they lost the capacity to live in each other's universe, and I think what happens with Sylvie in that moment where she kills Kang, right? She looks so determined. She kills him, and then he says, I'll see you again, and winks at her. And she realizes, I didn't understand this either. I made the wrong calculation. Whatever it is, we don't know, right? We don't know what that means. But
I wasn't wrinkling my nose at you, by the way, Maeve. The cat has taken an enormous shit right behind me, and that's so.
I think I'm leaving that in for the record. That's good content, you guys.
Please do. Please do.
In the litter box.
Yeah, I want to. Yeah, it's a good cat. I want to take a crack at Amanda's critique because I think it's an interesting and a good one, and I'd like you to tell me if I'm on the right track. So I like what Amanda is saying about this idea that it's like, well, what are we talking about? Because Thor and Loki are fighting each other, but then obviously once they team up, they fight alongside each other. But my take on what you're saying about this theme is this idea that war as a means to acquire the love that you are seeking, whether it is love of nation or you're seeking Helen of Troy in the Iliad, war as the means to acquire or complete or fulfill your love is bullshit. So once Thor and Loki are on the same side, they can fight together, right? You know, I guess if like Agamemnon and Helen wanted to team up after the Iliad or whatever, they could or something. I don't even know how to extend the analogy to the Iliad. But the idea is not that war and love can't happen in the same story, but that war can't be the means to acquire the end that is love. Do I have that right?
Right. And also that when you justify war on the grounds of love, you are misunderstanding what love is. That love isn't this thing that requires violence or that profits from violence. That it profits from a very different kind of engagement between humans.
So Loki and Sylvie fight. She chooses war, right? So essentially she's like, he's basically saying, hey, we can love each other as essentially like the outcome of this fight can be our love, which is essentially saying, hey, we fought this war. We're going to end up in love. And she's like, no, bro, I'll see you later. Maybe not. Kicks him through a time door. What is her resolution of her arc and her final moments with Kang say about this theme?
Well, I think that moment is a cliffhanger in exactly the same way that the end of the episode is a cliffhanger. So we have two cliffhangers in this story because she realizes that her conception of love and war doesn't add up in the same way that he realizes that his conception of love and war doesn't add up. They both end up crying at the resolution of her action against Kang. And then when Loki goes off, he realizes he's in some weirdo extra multiverse that she's kicked him into that is not the same as hers. And now how is he going to get back to her? And I do think that there is a love story that's written into this. But the idea that these things are dependent on one another is the thing that the show is critiquing. And like its invocation of Marx, it is a subtle invocation of this idea to start planting a seed in our minds about the way that we unite these ideas, that they don't belong together in the way that we think that they belong together. Neither justification nor outcome get us anywhere good. They only get us into a space of paralysis.
I took Sylvie's I took their conflict to be, to a large extent, and I think this shows you can kind of read the same text in many different ways. Yeah. I took it in a more bluntly feminist fashion, which was, it was a very touching reminder that even in well-meaning kind of love situations, our normal sexist ideas of men and women's relationships get in the way of true companionable love, because Loki couldn't help but when he was offered an opportunity to use power to kind of create the like love relationship he wanted. Yeah. He couldn't help but just think that that was the way forward. And he just couldn't see anymore that Sylvie didn't want love on the terms of oppression at all, period, of herself or anybody else. Right. And he wasn't offering to oppress her, but he was offering to love her in an oppressive system. And she said no to that. Right. I think it actually was a really beautiful example of how it gets complicated between men and women who love each other oftentimes in a patriarchal society, which is you can love somebody, but you can still fall back on these hierarchical power structures that actually hurt relationships. Yeah.
And it's funny you mentioned this because there was another moment in watching that fight scene between the two of them where he's constantly trying to calm her down, where I had this like lizard brain reaction against the stop, wait stuff, because Sylvie is rational. She's being thoroughly rational in these moments. It's not like she's like some kind of hysterical crazy person. The only crazy person in the room is Kang.
Yeah.
Loki is reacting to a situation and is in love.
And he's mansplaining, isn't he? I mean,
he's mansplaining. Yeah.
She's literally like, I have done this my whole life. And you listen to this guy for 5 minutes and you think I should change everything about how I view the world?
Yeah. She knows that he's lying. There's something wonderful about the exchange about the lies where Sylvie says he's lying to you or something like that. And Loki is like, I know a liar, except that he didn't recognize the fact that Kang has been lying to them from the beginning. When Kang first encounters them, when the elevator doors open, he says, wow, this is wild. If Kang knew what was going on or was going to go on, he knew the path, then that wouldn't be wild. So he was lying to them then. So Loki didn't see it then, but then sees something later that is truthful to him.
Right.
Loki is trying to construct a universe that feels coherent. And I think that to some extent, this goes back to the point I was making about love and war. We try to tell these stories that create coherence out of these ideas. In part, because war is an idea that is almost impossible for the human mind to wrap its head around, unless we're thinking about things that are, alien or whatever. And sometimes that's how war gets justified, that we make sense of war by way of a conception of the alien, the thing that can be unloved, that must be unloved, that must be destroyed, that is counter to our capacity to survive and flourish. So what Loki does is rationalize over the course of that entire exchange that basically takes up the entire episode. And Sylvie keeps interjecting with, he's lying. This is crazy. I don't know what you're thinking about. Like, how could you possibly follow this person through their chain of logic when this is so clearly deception?
And she's kind of fooled by the logic of war, though, to your point,
Sure.
Right? Which is like, even though she sees King, I think a lot more clearly for who he is than Loki does, she still has this notion that is really baked into superhero movies, and Marvel has started to challenge more and more as the movies go on and these TV shows. But she is still really attached to the idea that if I just kill this motherfucker,
Right.
Yeah.
then my problems are over. And she does kill him, and then, oh no, your problems in many ways have just begun.
Yeah. Her brow furrows. She realizes that this isn't the clear answer that it might have been in her conception.
I guess my question then, as you said, it's so hard to get out of these mentalities, is what are they supposed to do?
Yeah.
Like, maybe you're right. King is a liar. He says you have two choices: take my offer or kill me. Maybe their fault was like, that was the biggest lie of all.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Kang then. How does he fit this theme, Maeve?
I mean, Kang presents himself as kind of a warlord, even though he says, I've basically, thwarted a multiverse war that was going to take over everything. He presents himself as an imperialist warlord who has said, I've taken over all of these branching timelines, and his own affection for that is represented as a kind of unbridled desire. He's also notably lacking in any connection to any other human being. Mm-hmm. He's an isolationist, an individualist. He's got no connection in the way that Sylvie and Loki do, which may not have succeeded here, but it was maybe on the verge of succeeding here.
Well, his argument for why he has to have control is exactly the same argument for Cold War armament, isn't it not?
Yeah.
Like, it was basically the peace only through war. Like, we must arm up. If we can't absolutely annihilate the planet, then we will have no peace.
Right. That if it's a universal stalemate at all times where we all sit around worrying about when X country is going to launch a nuclear missile at us.
Yeah. That your choices are hot war and cold war, but there's no peace. There's no real peace.
There's no real conception of peace. This show did something different in its opening credits that it hasn't done in any other beginning of an episode in the entirety of this stable of shows. So we get these opening credits. It's kind of a mixtape of heroes from the Marvel Cinematic Universe saying things that they say that we recognize, and a bunch of historical figures. Neil Armstrong, Nelson Mandela, Greta Thunberg, Malala. And I'm sure a lot of people watching this show were like, why? Why add all these historical figures? And the way that I was beginning to make sense of it in the context of thinking about this theme was that we have a bunch of historical figures. People who were demanding a different way of understanding our fellow human beings, not as instruments of war, or instruments of conflict of some other kind, but in instruments of a capacity to do something together. So when Neil Armstrong lands on the moon and says what he says about this being a step for all of us, he's actually rejecting a Cold War argument. He's rejecting the idea that he's doing it because he's beating the Russians out. He's doing something utterly profound and revolutionary. He's an instrument of the government, of the military. And he rejects the chain of command, shows up on the moon and says, this is mankind.
Which is interesting because it's the exact opposite of King's trajectory, which is he started as a scientist and ended as a warlord.
That's exactly right.
Well, and there's another element of love in that opening credit, which is It's Been a Long, Long Time, which is Steve and Peggy's song, which is the ultimate love story of the MCU. And it's their dance song that starts in the first Captain America and culminates in Endgame. And so,
which is Steve abandoning war for love.
Right. In fact, he cannot be with Peggy until he completely opts out of everything, and of course lets all the terrible things that he knows are coming happen anyway, but we'll get to that on Pondervision. We always talk about that. But anyway, yeah.
In that opening set of credits, we get these two samples from classical music. We get a clip from Swan Lake and a clip from Moonlight Sonata, very short one. Both of them are stories of love. Swan Lake is a story of a prince who is deceived and falls in love with a woman who's been turned into a swan and then decides to abandon his princely responsibilities and ascend into a space of love with this swan woman. Moonlight Sonata, Beethoven wrote and dedicated to the woman that he proposed marriage to. Right, so we have cut into a series of declarations of what humans can do together, a la Marx. What can we do when we abandon God, when we abandon war as the best thing that humans can achieve? We have love, which is not some kind of simple romantic love. And this goes back to our last episode, talking about the expansive conception of love. That human beings recognizing humanity in one another, loving our communal capacity, we can achieve all kinds of extraordinary things, but we have to let go of a lot of the stuff that we've been taught is the most important thing. Domination, imperial expansion, Kang. Right? We have to be able to let go of these things. And that is one of the hardest things that humans will, if we are going to survive. Greta Thunberg, she's right. If we are going to survive, we have to let go of that conception of domination, that is the most powerful thing that we're capable of.
What else speaks to this same kind of idea of challenging the compatibility of love and war?
All the way through this episode, while watching Kang's obsessive defense of his own domineering personality, authoritative personality, I couldn't help but think about Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is a fairly short text, kind of a hard read, honestly, because it's really poetic. All of Conrad's writing is very poetic, long sentences. My own students have a really hard time reading Heart of Darkness. But it is an extraordinary story, an extraordinary representation of the kind of derangement that comes from the Imperial War Project, which is not unlike what we see Kang talking about. So Joseph Conrad is writing about British imperialism in Africa, and he's writing about a character named Marlowe, who is the protagonist of the story, who at the beginning of the story tells us that his entire childhood he spent fantasizing about all the blank spaces, I'm putting those in quotes, all the quote, blank spaces, unquote, that he saw on the continent of Africa. That, of course, all British children were taught about in the 19th century. That these are blank spaces, unoccupied, except that there are people there. And then we have to use violence to subdue them. And that's okay. So Marlowe shows up in the colonies and he has a job, but that's kind of irrelevant to the story because what he eventually discovers is that this character, Kurtz, has gone what the language of the era would have called native. So Kurtz has become kind of a deity among the native population in his outpost. And Marlowe eventually discovers him, but Kurtz is also wild with derangement. He has lost his mind.
Right.
Yeah. Power has made him mad.
Power has made him mad. And this is what Marlowe realizes over the course of the narrative, that this imperial project turns people insane.
Yeah, makes them monsters.
Well, and I mean, obviously the movie Apocalypse Now is based on Heart of Darkness, and then Heart of Darkness, the documentary, is based this is a mirror dimension in and of itself. But I mean, it was hard to not watch Jonathan Majors' acting job and not think of Marlon Brando's kind of weird syntax and the way he just imbued Colonel Kurtz with that kind of, it's
like a manic exhaustion that they both share, right?
Yeah.
They both talk about how tired they are, but at the same time are propelled by this abstract passion for the certainty of their unique will to power. And the other thing is, of course, last episode, a lot of folks noticed that there was a Flight of the Valkyries sound-alike, which really clued us in and should have clued us in that there was a Kurtz waiting for us at the end of the road.
At the end. Which is fun because both Kurtz in Heart of Darkness and Kang in Loki are figures that are incomplete in their stories. So Kang dies and says, I'll see you again, and winks. Kurtz at the end of his story, dying with Marlowe, says the horror, the horror. And this is one of the most interpreted moments in literary history because nobody really knows if he is referring to empire as the horror, which is the post-imperial dominant interpretation of that moment. Or if he's saying something else is horrifying.
Yeah.
Who knows what it is? We don't know. There's a cliffhanger at the end of Heart of Darkness. There's a cliffhanger at the end of this episode. There is more to be told about that story, but what we do know at the end of Heart of Darkness is that Kurtz has given personal papers to Marlowe to take with him because he can't go any further. He has some kind of fever. Marlowe has also gotten sick, but Marlowe survives. Marlowe goes to see the intended, who is Kurtz's fiancé. And Kurtz's fiancé says, what did he say when he was dying? And Marlowe says, he said your name.
Well, I mean, if you read the book, it's pretty clear what the symbolism there is, which is she is this, I think in the modern parlance, we'd call her a Karen.
Well, exactly. But this goes to my point, right? That the idea there is that love is consistent with the imperial project. That all of this stuff that happened for her is now okay. She's grieving the loss of somebody who she loved, who has been dead for an entire year before Marlowe gets back to like tell her hey, here's the deal, right? She is satisfied by that argument. Marlowe is not. And there the dichotomy splits. He says this thing that she wants to hear, and she's kind of the Karen in that narrative, right? And Marlowe, he's a little bit propagating a kind of patriarchal myth that women at home are kind of okay with the violence abroad as long as they're getting something out of it.
Because they don't see it. Yeah. Right. And it's hidden from them, and they can have their white dresses and flowers and pristine world.
Yeah. And, of course, the historical reality was that women were as anti-colonialist as men were in the period, were as attuned to the realities of imperialism to the extent that people were in the moment. But on the other hand, we do have a split happening in that narrative between the imperialist critique, right, coming from Marlowe, which says this might, in fact, be a horror. And here's the story we tell back at home. That love of nation, love of a woman, love of an idea, love of God, whatever it happens to be, is enough to justify the violence that kills so many people.
Renslayer kind of plays that role a little bit in this narrative, right? She's the person who props up the order at home that the violence, the Kurtz-like violence is really kind of concealing.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Yeah. That's really smart.
Well, thank you both. Those are incredible themes to ponder and chew on and many works to explore. I just want to leave folks with my last thought on this finale, and really I think this series, which is that there's a story here that is interrogating the extent to which we can overcome our nature and our weaknesses. Kang created the entire TVA in order to prune essentially versions of himself that he considers more weak, but he's trying to rein in his own weaknesses. He is, of course, ultimately unsuccessful in that because Sylvie kills him and all of the other Kangs are going to be running around doing their thing. In the end, Sylvie gives in to her revenge and cynicism and plows forth with that knife into Kang, which may or may not turn out to be the right call at the end of the day, but certainly the reasons that she made that choice arguably fed the weaknesses she had been striving to overcome. And in her battle with Loki basically wound up arguing the same thing he did all the way back in 2012 Avengers movie, that, hey, maybe it's just okay to, impose order on all these other beings. Maybe that's okay in order to have our own ends. And in their battle, he says to her that their standoff essentially comes down to the fact that she can't trust and he can't be trusted, which are their essential weaknesses brought forth once again, their arcs kind of crumbling before them. Meanwhile, Mobius stands for the ability to change. It's almost all he ever talks about. But Ravonna won't even entertain the notion. And in the end, when we look at Loki, he has lost everything.
Yeah.
He has lost Sylvie. He has lost Mobius. He has lost his own reality. What did Mobius say in the first episode? That Lokis are destined to lose? Is that not the ultimate weakness of all for our Loki? Now, this is a cliffhanger, so in no way do I think the series itself will, of course, land on the idea that we cannot improve. But I think this particular episode is very much pointing out that this is a non-linear process for all of us, that we can fall backwards, that we can lose ground in the struggle to improve. And I look forward to the way that the show will interrogate the process of pushing past those limitations in season 2. But Amanda, if folks want to talk to you a little bit more about whether this is an atheistic episode that challenges the idea that we ought to invent a god even if we don't have one, where can they find and follow you?
I'm on Twitter at Amanda Marcotte, and you can go to salon.com and read me write about all sorts of things that are very rarely atheism.
And Maeve, if people want to talk to you about the idea that love and war are, maybe more incompatible than we've been led to believe by most of our fiction and literature and propaganda throughout time, where can they find and follow you?
You can find me at Maeve Adams on Twitter, MaeveAdams, or you can read my work at academia.edu.
And if you want to talk to me about how fucking hard it is to overcome your weaknesses, you can find me on Twitter at Marc Faletti. That's Marc with a C. All right, Audio Avengers, that's the show for today. We have much more Loki finale to discuss on Pondervision and Character Cast, so keep your ears open for them on Saturday and Monday. Then we will go on a bit of a break. We'll do some fun episodes for What If when it premieres in August, but maybe more like one every other week versus 3 per week, just because all of us need to catch our breath for a while. But if you're enjoying the show, please leave us a 5-star Apple review so we can rise in those search rankings. And if you want to talk to me some more, you can hit me up on that Twitter, but also on any of the Marvelous TV Club pages, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all with the handle Marvelous TV Club. All right, team, let's go start a bunch of multiverse fights with the Storycast crews from all the other timelines, because fuck those people.